Freedom of religion, a growing issue in the UK. It's a massive topic and it's only going to be possible to scratch the surface of it in this session. But my aim is by the end of the session to have looked objectively at whether freedom of religion is genuinely an issue for Christians, and if so, how we engage with this. I think the starting point is to consider fundamental British values. Now, for some of us, that may be tutting at somebody who tries to push in a queue, or being reluctant to take the last bit of poppadom in the curry house. The government would have us believe that it is the concept of mutual respect and tolerance for those of different faiths and beliefs. So therefore, if the government is right, we would no doubt take great issue with a country that said you could not hold public office because of your religious beliefs, or that unless you were prepared to take an oath disavowing those beliefs, you couldn't hold public office or indeed work in the armed forces. Except for the UK, that indeed has been part of our history and was our historic position, as historically a British value. And this was the position for Roman Catholics as a consequence of the Test Acts in the 17th century. Effectively now we have freedom, but with the scope for it being abused. And in 1950 we have the European Convention on Human Rights, the introduction of which talks of the profound belief in those fundamental freedoms which are the foundation of justice and peace in the world. Something that sets up the concept of rights, but effectively supplanting Christianity, that we have our value from rights, not from our Creator or our Redeemer. The two fundamental rights that we would be interested on for this topic would be Article 9, the freedom of thought, conscience and religion, and Article 10, freedom of expression. These are qualified rights, meaning that there are obligations that take precedence over them. For example, protection of health and morals and protection of the rights and reputations of others. Generally speaking, even with that in place, it was not unlawful to treat somebody differently because of their religious beliefs. And there were generally limited protections, although there were some, for example, Sikhs not having to wear motorcycle helmets when on motorbikes, the ability to opt out of Sunday working for those in the retail industry and rather peculiarly the gaming industry as well, and being able to opt out of certain provision of abortion services as well as blasphemy laws. The law finds religion much easier to cope with. Questions about burial rituals, particular dietary requirements, prayer rituals, than the concept of faith itself, particularly when it comes to the Christian faith. So a judge may understand why somebody wants to wear particular clothing and is able to assess, well, what's the impact upon the organisation that perhaps has its own clothing requirements. How do we balance those two up? That's a bit easier than trying to persuade a judge that a decision that may be unpopular with the judge or maybe going against the flow in modern society should be allowed because the decision was made in accordance with what the prompting of the Holy Spirit was. Difficult concepts for a judge to get his head around. In 2011, the Public Sector Equality Duty came into place, which imposes a positive obligation within the public sector that they need to have due regard to the need to eliminate discrimination, including discrimination on the grounds of religion and belief. So surely with these laws in place, with the Equality Act, with the Public Sector Equality Duty, and also in the background, the European Convention on Human Rights, surely that means that we have greater freedom of religion than ever before. Well, whilst we do have the power of the law to protect us, and it also protects us from others, which it did not previously do, there is this duality because we want the freedom to express our faith, but also we want the freedom from those things that go against our conscience. And it's the same for everyone in society. So for those who do not like our faith, who do not want to hear the gospel message, the law has to give them the freedom to be saved from hearing that message. So it's the rights-based approach that I have the right to live out my faith, but you have the right not to be impacted by it. In the words of Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. So where is the line drawn? And the first question that I have is, what for you are the most important areas of religious freedom? Why is that? And is there a scripture that informs your view? Following on from that question, some of the answers you might have come up with as matters that are important for you may have been the need to be able to proclaim the gospel, issues going to the authority of the Bible, and conscience, not being compelled to do something against your faith. Now, there can sometimes be fairly loose talk about this country being one where there is persecution of Christians, which I think is a gross misrepresentation and doesn't do it justice to those in other countries where there is genuine persecution. For example, if I were to declare my faith now, proclaim John 3:16, I'm not in fear of suddenly people battering down the door and coming to arrest me or imprison me. But if I were to stand up in a theatre during a performance and be proclaiming the gospel, when people are wanting me to so they can watch the performance, well, should I then be ejected? So there is this balancing act, and there is a similar balancing act wherever somebody might be, whether it's on a street corner, or whether it's on the train, whether it's in the workplace, of what somebody should be permitted to do and the extent to which it interferes with the rights and freedoms of others. And the second question that I have, therefore, is bearing that in mind, do Christians have an increased fear now of what will happen if they speak up about their faith? And if so, why do you think that is? In response to that last question, some of the thoughts that you may have had could be, yes, there's an increased fear, and some of that comes down to cases that Christians have brought, whether it's the outcome of the case going against the Christian, or perhaps the idea that they would have had to have brought the case in the first place to establish something that is surely common sense. Sometimes it can be because cases are misunderstood or misreported. For example, I often hear people telling me about a poor lady at British Airways who was dismissed because she wanted to wear a cross. And of course she wasn't dismissed at all, although she was temporarily suspended from work. So there can sometimes be a misreporting, misunderstanding of cases. I think also there's a spiritual factor. There is a fear, perhaps from a lack of faith, that holds us back, and we can be looking for an excuse and use that fear in order to justify us not wanting to speak up about our faith. I think perhaps there's a fear from others about the consequences of allowing Christians that freedom, particularly in an employment context, that we may be perceived as Christians as being the discriminators, that we are the issue in order to be tolerated, and people are increasingly reluctant to do that. And I think overall, it may be because it is becoming increasingly less common to actually declare our faith. And so the fewer people do it, the more unusual it becomes, and there is a vicious spiral there. However, I think that reports of that's the wrong way of putting it. However, I think some of the fear is certainly misplaced. If you were to read the newspapers, you might think there are a lot of cases involving Christians who are being treated badly in the workplace. For example, in 2015-2016, there were over 83,000 employment tribunal claims. Now, not all of those go to a hearing, and the ones that tend to go to a hearing are ones where there may be felt to be a lot financially at stake, where the evidence could go either way, or perhaps a good claim against a foolish employer who tries to defend it, or a weak claim from a foolish employee. But of those cases, more than 12,000 related to discrimination on the grounds of age. Of those relating to religious belief, there were only 340 cases, less than 0.4%. And when it comes to the awards, well, perhaps we might be concerned, Christians don't get fair compensation. Well, the median award for discrimination on the grounds of religion and belief in 2015 and 2016 was higher than the median award with regard to discrimination on the grounds of age, race, sex, and disability. So we need to be aware of sometimes the message that the media might be feeding to us and be prepared to scratch beneath the surface. And furthermore, some cases that might be reported as being successful, when you scratch beneath the surface, may not be. An example of that would be the 2013 case against the UK government involving Nadia Oweda. Now, whilst Ms. Oweda succeeded in her claim and British Airways were found to have discriminated against her by not allowing her to wear a cross, part of their reasoning was British Airways actually changing their mind and allowing her to wear the cross. The upshot effectively being that if they'd have been a bit more belligerent as an employer, they wouldn't have lost the case. So perhaps sending a message to employers that, in fact, you need to be less accommodating of Christians. There are, however, bad decisions. I'm not going to go into detail in this session, but there are decisions where Christians have been put in very difficult positions, and where you wonder whether the judges had a full grasp of the impact of the decision. The next question is for us to wonder whether it will get harder for Christians to share their faith. And why do you think that? And what responsibility does that place upon you? Going back to the question of what responsibility does that place upon you, or indeed upon me, to an extent that was a slightly unfair question, because my personal view is that if it does get harder for Christians to share our faith, then indeed that increases the importance of us to do so. If it isn't going to get harder, well, then we have those freedoms and we should be utilising them. Either way, there's no getting away from the importance of being able to share our faith. So the fear perhaps of doing so, if that fear is holding us back, maybe one way of trying to establish whether that is the genuine reason is to look at other aspects of our lives. If I'm not talking about my faith in the workplace because of fear of what might happen in the workplace, am I doing it elsewhere? In general terms, I think we have incredible freedom within this country. But that said, there is some marginalisation of Christians. And why is that? Some of it may be that employers have become less tolerant for fear of claims of harassment by those who are hostile to religious beliefs. There can also be the idea of tyranny of the majority, those seeking to impose secular democracy. Those who make a public stand for their faith and who are in the public eye can often be ridiculed for it. There can be religious illiteracy, not just those who don't understand the Christian faith, but don't realise they don't understand it. Or perhaps wanting to make a distinction between a belief that can be held in private, but certainly not expressed in public, and that that's acceptable. I also think that we have not stood up. But we do need to either speak up or continue to keep our heads down. And when it comes to speaking up, I think there is a particular responsibility for those who are able to express their religious beliefs well. For those who are educated and literate, it doesn't simply come down to them, but when it comes down to issues of apologetics, it is very important for those who have been gifted with words are the ones to take a lead in the workplace. I think also there is a lack of public sympathy for Christians as well. A British trait is that we quite like the underdog, the person overcoming the odds, but we don't like a person claiming victim status. And we can perhaps, as Christians, become at risk of claiming victim status. I think the situation is likely to get worse. We see coming up pressure to prevent what may be perceived as hate speech because it is something that is unwelcome. The concept of trigger warnings because what you're saying is unwelcome to me and I may find it offensive. And perhaps of greatest concern, we have the Casey Review. Now, in July 2015, at the request of the then Prime Minister, there was a review undertaken by Dame Louise Casey. And her report set out the findings of that review. And she says that there is evidence that some people, in particular ethnic and faith communities, have views around LGBT people that are at odds with mainstream modern British values and laws. It goes on to say that while many people in the UK appear to be seeing religion as increasingly less important, and in some cases less of a force for good, for others it's very important in their daily lives. But within this latter group, there appear to be some who are keen to take religion backwards and away from 21st century British values and laws on issues such as gender equality and sexual orientation. And it talks about a twisted version of Islam that some promote, although there is good argument that that twisted version is nevertheless rooted in the Quran and the Hadith and the example of Muhammad. That perhaps there's a tendency to say, well, the version of a religious belief that I don't like, whether it's Islam, whether it's Christianity, well, that's twisted. The one that I do like, well, that's acceptable. And it may become a similar position for Christians, that Christian beliefs that may be rooted in the Bible, but become publicly unacceptable, get labelled as being a twisted version of Christian beliefs. The other thing in the case review has the idea of an oath for public office. So in order to increase standards of leadership and integrity in public office, by ensuring that British values such as respect for the rule of law, equality and tolerance are enshrined in the principles of public life, and developing a new oath for holders of public office. Which means we're heading back to where we started right at the beginning. Bars from public office, oaths, all coming back in full circle in pursuit of the idea of tolerance. So how can the typical Christian or Christian lawyer in particular get involved? I think the first thing is to actually be a lawyer. Consider John 7:51. Research a case beyond the headline. There's now a public register of employment tribunal judgments. So if you see a case mentioned in the paper that was at an employment tribunal level, why not read what it actually says for yourself? You can write to your MP. If you're in the constituency, they will certainly pay some attention to that and include your details within the email so they know that you're actually in their constituency. Engage in public consultations. Look to shape the landscape rather than be resigned to living within it. Consider Romans 12, verse 2. I think what the cases in the press show is that there is an interest. Our evangelism is not about getting people to church, it is about them hearing the message. If they don't come to church, we have to take it to them, which is a fundamental shift. And it's important that we do so, as otherwise the landscape of religious freedom might look very different for future generations.